I'm joined now by Orkhan Amashov, Deputy Editor-in-Chief here at A News. Orkhan, very good to see you as always. Now, in every sense, we are looking at the bigger picture tonight, Orkhan. We've previously been focusing very much on the Strait of Hormuz, undeniably critically important. However, there's something bigger going on here, isn't there, beyond just that location?
Absolutely. Quite often when something very dramatic and highly consequential is happening across the world, in one particular part of the world, our instinct is to look at that development, dissect it, but quite often we miss a larger picture. And quite often it has been suggested, and with the consensus regarding that effectively emerging, that all of these confrontations involving the Venezuela and Iran is not just about Iran and Venezuela, it's about the wider US-China competition. After all, from the US perspective, there's only one power, which is on par with the United States, and that must be tackled, that is China. Quite frankly, this is a clear reflection of the change which has been happening over the past couple of years. China is a main competitor, and US does see China as a competitor to be dealt with. Iran is one of the key suppliers, the key supplier of China in terms of oil, and of course naturally China gets oil at discount, and it's basically 10-20% below the global benchmarks, Brent benchmarks, but it's very useful. So basically China provides Iran with all the necessary technologies, enables Iran to fund all of its proxies, which keeps the United States incredibly busy, because the US needs to invest heavily in the Middle East. It needs to heavily help Israel in order to be able to tackle all of these problems. This is effectively China's policy to keep US busy, bogged down in the Middle East, and not being able to compete with China where it matters a great deal, which is in the Pacific region. So the big picture we talk about is that China-US competition, and each single conflict that we have witnessed over the past couple of months, including the last one, inevitably is part of that kaleidoscope event.
Okay, what do you think? Some analysts have spoken about this whole prosecution of this war really being one part of a strategic jigsaw that was started some time ago. They talk about the US and the work done in Venezuela, preempting this, and the combination of the two actually putting enormous pressure on China.
Absolutely. Venezuela was part of the self-same thinking. It was about actually weakening China's economic prowess, enabling the United States to cut off that supply chain. And Iran is part of the similar dimension. It's more about China than about Russia, of course. We have discussed on a number of occasions. Regarding this latest, the doctrine of the United States about national defense doctrine, clearly the focus there is that instead of reacting to something after events happen, we should not react in a reactionary fashion, but we need to preemptively conduct our affairs in such a way that our adversaries denied those opportunities. It's all about, in terms of power concentration, resource concentration, focus on the Indo-Pacific in such a way that Europe is becoming secondary. It's no longer key focus of US foreign policy thinking, and the gravity of world politics and bigger competition effectively moving from transatlantic to Indo-Pacific, with China being the key focus. That particular national defense strategy to which we referred earlier focuses on China in such a way that China should be disallowed to project greater power in that region in such a way that that first line of defense involves Taiwan, which is part of China, in line with one China policy, Japan and Philippines becoming the first line of defense. That China should not be able to project any power beyond that first line of defense. That is effectively about making sure China is never able to reach the global supremacy to the extent of challenging US domination. I think there's a clear realization when it comes to US strategic thinking. They understand, and this particular doctrine and the Secretary of Defense, Department of Defense, Elbridge Colby, with whose name this doctrine is associated, this doctrine is effectively acknowledging the US would not be able to govern everything that US wants to govern. You cannot pull the strings everywhere. There will be certain regional domains where regional powers will be putting the strings. For example, Middle East, Turkey, Israel, and then India and China here, and so forth. But what matters for United States now, first of all, homeland security, the Western Hemisphere, in the Pacific region, and any commitment to European security becomes secondary matter. And that's the reason we see in US thinking, the thinking that in the light of ongoing war in Ukraine, US does not treat Ukraine as a major risk to its national interest in Europe. What matters for them is China, and therefore US putting massive pressure on NATO allies to increase their budgetary sort of requirements, and 5% contribution to defense spending is one. United States is demanding that NATO allies are to be involved in this unblocking business of the Strait of Hormuz. And we know that European countries have not reacted the way US expected it to react. By means of doing that, US doing two fundamental things. First of all, it treats its European allies, NATO allies, as secondary.
Yes.
So, we all know that all the empires, Guy, they were envisioning the world in their own image, which is a natural thing. I think US is no longer imagining the world in its own image. US just wants to control vital things. For them, not everything, but what matters now comes to the forefront.
And crucially, Orkhan, they're saying it out loud.
Yeah.
Which really hasn't happened before, to my knowledge. We were talking to Peter Roth about this earlier, that everybody knows that the US is the biggest NATO member, is the most powerful country in the world, but it's very rare that a leader would say it so overtly, and it's changed the nature of things, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not just about the language and rhetoric. I think it is testifying to something deep happening inside the US establishment. There are those who would sort of attribute this to Donald Trump's personality, but I think it goes beyond his personality. And this probably, I think, testifies to the relative decline of US as a world's superpower. Before in 1990s, even earlier than that, there was no need to say the US was a foremost power, because US was. And when you're quite powerful, you do not need to make that very obvious by means of talking about it, because everybody realizes that you are incredibly important. I think that necessity of talking about extensively, necessity of President Donald Trump always saying that we are the world's greatest power, no power of this magnitude has ever emerged, is actually a reflection that the US is not entirely sure about its own attributes. I think that's the way it's a sign of retrenchment in a certain sense, but it's also a sense of the priorities must be re-established. So US fully understand it cannot fund everybody, and that's the reason why they are sort of relinquishing their earlier commitments to the UN, and they're focusing on China, because China is the only power around the world which could actually challenge US supremacy. And this gentleman, whose name we mentioned earlier, Elbridge Colby, comes from a very illustrious national security establishment family.
Yes, you were telling me in the break.
His grandfather, William Colby, was director of CIA. He is considered to be bipartisan. He's not particularly, I mean, he's of course, naturally, he's a third ranking, I think, official in the Department of Defense in the United States. He's a key strategist of the Department of Defense, and he's not particularly associated with Republicans or Democrats. And I think what is happening is not just about Trump, it's about US thinking, sort of shifting from transatlantic centered vision to the Indo-Pacific. And in the fullness of time, I think there will be massive challenge for European countries.
Okay, what about Europe in all of this? If you look at the Colby doctrine, you look at the way the world, for the time being at least, has in many meaningful ways shifted more to a multipolar world than a multilateral one. We've seen hesitancy amongst EU member states and the UK. We've seen disagreement, different positions. The bloc struggling really to appear relevant and integral to some of these negotiations.
Absolutely.
How difficult now is all of this for the EU?
I think it's a massively difficult situation for the European Union and wider European continent, because Europe is increasingly and inevitably, and I would say regrettably, becoming less relevant to the entire affairs of the world. Europe 100 years ago was an epicenter, but now it's in decline. But the question is that you have to recognize that you're in decline and you need to do something about it. Because decline not always means terminal decline. It could be reversible. If Europe does fully understand that it should be growth oriented. It should be European Union. If European Union wants to project greater power, they want to transmogrify from being an economic powerhouse, which Europe is, into geopolitical force, which Europe isn't at this very juncture. It's becoming increasingly irrelevant. I fully understand, I'm sure everybody understands that for Europe to be able to maintain its strategic autonomy, it should not follow everything the US is saying. And in many ways, if European countries are not part of this US-Israel joint attack on Iran, there are many reasons why they shouldn't be involved in that. First of all, their resources are quite limited. I think UK foreign policy was very judicious in the context of not being involved in the offensive strike, by letting US use UK bases for defensive purposes. But the problem there is that the Prime Minister Keir Starmer failed to manage the special relationship. As the policy thinking behind what UK has been doing regarding this conflict was absolutely judicious. UK shouldn't be part of it, but UK should make sure that the special relationship is not damaged, and it is being damaged because of what Trump said earlier about UK being once a United States' greatest power, greatest ally, is something which will not be rectified in the fullness of time. There are certain elements of damage which, when they are done, they produce long-term consequences. I'm afraid the special relationship is no longer what it used to be. I think we could talk about a special relationship, not the special relationship. Number two fact, please do.
No, I'm just thinking, if the UK cannot or will not get closer to Donald Trump, does it not make sense for them to try to get closer to Europe?
Well, perhaps, but the entire US, this would be the best possible thing under the current administration for Sir Keir Starmer, who is not a Brexiteer, but Remainer, and currently his government is pursuing the policy of getting closer to Europe. But I think that if once you're outside the European Union, your policy should have been based on actually navigating between the two power centres, Washington and Brussels. Going back to Europe would diminish UK's standing, and UK should do the best thing humanly imaginable, try to navigate between those two power centres. Another important point when it comes to UK and Europe is their foreign policy towards China. So basically, when US is treating China as a key competitor, Europe's importance is naturally diminishing. But Europe has got its own relationship with China, which is not really in line with US foreign policy. And a very good example of that distinction, that fundamental discrepancy when it comes to Europe and the United States is this middle corridor geography, which brings us to the point when we can actually apply the new national defense strategy of the US into Azerbaijani circumstances and its environs. US is interested in the middle corridor because the US wants Central Asia to be connected with Europe. And US wants to get access to the rare earth minerals of Central Asia, but does not want China to benefit from that. And that will create a completely new reality for this region because, as you know, Azerbaijan has got good relations with China, in fact, comprehensive strategic partnership, but also growing strategic relation with the United States. So this region, this actor will be able to navigate, to make sure this region, South Caucasus, is not the place of geopolitical contest. Currently it isn't, but potentially it may be. And we need to be ready for every eventuality when the right time comes. Yeah, it's
certainly becoming more of a conduit than a contest for sure. And we've seen in Europe, haven't we, many European leaders really make strong overtures to China, visits by Merz, Macron, Starmer. Unclear what tangibly has emerged from that.
I mean, even Charles Michel, former president of European Council, whom I interviewed on one occasion, and some other colleagues interviewed as well, has been talking about Europe being in need of having this independent policy with interests of Europe taken into account in such a way that China becomes the central focal point. Because what matters for Europe, and transatlantic rupture has happened a long time ago. This was a consensus post-1945 world. And Britain, France, despite the fact that they emerged as victors, they were heavily reliant on the United States. And that worked for 50 years, basically. And after the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War mentality gave way to new realities, wherein China found itself as a new country. And soon later, it emerged as a key competitor. And Europe is no longer in a position of being that relevant to United States. Because when Soviet Union was in existence, they did treat United States, did treat Soviet Union as a key enemy, And if you treat Soviet Union as a key enemy, naturally you need to be very supportive of the European Union, back to the European community. But now that Russia is considered to be secondary, the importance of the war in Ukraine is not that massively important to the United States. That's the reason they say, well, it's dangerous, of course. Of course, it's bad that Ukraine's 20% of territory is occupied, but we can't help it. It's not the key priority. And in fact, perhaps Russia is not completely wrong. And this goes, in that particular respect, Europe and the United States are at loggerheads. But when it comes to China, they're again at loggerheads because Europe needs to have good and mutually beneficial relations with China, whereas the US is fully hell-bent on diminishing China's role. So really, we've moved from transatlantic rupture to a new sort of a competition between Europe and the United States.
And do you think that if that endures, that situation between Europe and the United States, that it could push Europe to making stronger and stronger connections with China,
absolutely,
at the continued expense of their relationship with the US?
I'm afraid this is exactly what is happening now. This is what you said, the central element of what's happening, with Europe being disillusioned with the United States, and with United States national strategy having absolutely no mention of Europe and actually being very critical of Europe. Europe naturally, in order to maintain and entrench its autonomy, will do its level best to have constructive relations with China in order to balance China against the United States. So we're no longer talking about, I interviewed Romano Prodi recently,
yes,
a couple of days ago, and I interviewed Bonet a couple of days, and he was incredibly unhappy and very skeptical about the future of Europe. I said, well, look, Mr. Prime Minister, just 100 years ago, Europe was the epicenter of the world. When you were talking about the world politics, you meant London, Paris, and to a certain extent even Rome, Berlin, and definitely not Washington. Now things have changed so dramatically that Europe is no longer epicenter, but Europe is secondary. What will become of Europe? And to be absolutely honest with you, and he's 92 years old, and he has seen a lot of things. He has not been just Prime Minister of Italy, but also President of the European Commission. He wasn't very hopeful, and I didn't see any glimpse of hope economically in his eyes when I put that question to him.
I mean, President Trump is, I think it's fair to say, playing a pretty dangerous game militarily and potentially one economically too. Do you think, obviously, enormous GDP, huge military power, it would take a lot to cause serious damage to such a huge country. But do you think there is a possibility here that they could have miscalculated this relationship between China, Europe, this region here, and also this corridor conduit role that Azerbaijan, Central Asia could play?
Well, I think that there's no miscalculation when it comes to Azerbaijan and South Caucasus. US does not treat this region as the place where it's going to compete with China, which provides for actors in this region, Azerbaijan and others, maneuverability, which they're going to enjoy fully. I think United States, I'm always talking about UK, United States is fully conscious of the fact that this region is exercising geopolitical balancing act, and there's nothing wrong about it, because China is not really very powerful here. But when it comes to the wider picture regarding Iran, there might have been some miscalculation. But I think President Donald Trump, for all the bombastic part of his persona, is driven by cold reason, whether we like it or not. The fact that he's diminishing Europe is not necessarily against American interests. He does consider Europe as a weakest link in the transatlantic alliance, if there is such an alliance still. But of course, naturally, intelligence sharing, all of these things are in place. Miscalculation is indeed possible. But I think the key parameters of his foreign policy, which sees China as a main enemy and tries to limit it without actually dismantling it. There's no question of China being sort of dismantled from the US perspective. China is an important power. China accounts for the 20-25% of the world's GDP, and that the 50% of the world's GDP is actually concentrated in this part of the world. The United States is not against China being powerful here. The United States does not want China project power beyond this region, and hence this entire concept of first line of defense, including those three entities: Taiwan, which is part of China, Japan, and the Philippines.
Fascinating stuff, Orkhan. Always a delight to have you with us in the studio.
Pleasure and privilege of mine.
Thank you very much indeed.